Hi, my name is David Christopher Lane. I'm the founder of the Neural Surfer YouTube channel. I'm also a professor of philosophy at Mount San Antonio College. What I bring you now in this audiobook is called the Visions of Sri Ramakrishna, who I first learned about probably in my teenage years, probably when I went to the Vedanta temple that became famous because of Aldous Huxley and Christopher Irshwood. And they were fascinated by Advaita Vedanta, but particularly the Vedanta school of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. I think what you'll find fascinating about Ramakrishna is his very first vision that he has as a young boy when he's walking through a paddy field during the monsoon season in Bengal. And he sees a beautiful black sky, black clouds, and he sees a series of white cranes flying against it. So the juxtaposition is aesthetically so beautiful to him that he actually swoons and faints out of pure joy, out of the beauty of it. And this will later lead to his visions later in life, which are much more religious in their import. But I think you'll find his life fascinating. Even if you might be skeptical or critical or analytical or take a more neuroscientific approach, I think you'll find that he's a fascinating character in the history of religion. He's particularly well revered in India. I hope you enjoy it as much as I have. Thank you so much.
The White Cranes Against Blackened Clouds. The Visions of Sri Ramakrishna. 1. The Paddy Field. It was the month of Jaishtha, or perhaps Ashada, early in the monsoon season, probably of 1842 or 1843, when the sky over rural Bengal turns the color of wet slate, and the air itself seems to hold its breath before the rains. A boy of 6 or 7, by his own later reckoning, for the childhood dates rest on his reminiscences alone, small and dark-eyed, was walking along one of the narrow raised paths that thread between the flooded rice paddies outside the village of Kamarpukur in the Hooghly district some 60 miles northwest of Calcutta. He was carrying a small basket of puffed rice, eating as he walked, on an errand of no importance whatsoever. The boy's name was Gadadhar Chattopadhyay. The world would come to know him as Sri Ramakrishna. What happened next he described many times in later life, always with the same essential details. A great storm cloud, blue-black and immense, rose swiftly over the horizon and spread across the sky. And then, against that darkness, a flock of cranes appeared, snow-white, flying in a line, cutting across the face of the cloud. The contrast overwhelmed him. Recalling it decades later, he said the sight was so beautiful that he became completely absorbed in it, that he lost all outward consciousness, and that the puffed rice scattered from his hands as he fell. Villagers working nearby found the boy unconscious on the embankment and carried him home in their arms. His parents were frightened. Neighbors speculated about seizures, about spirits. But Gadadhar himself, when he came to, insisted on something stranger and simpler. He had not been ill. He had felt, he said, an inexpressible joy, a rush of feeling so intense that the ordinary world had simply switched off, the way a lamp is extinguished by a gust of wind. Biographers of saints are professionally fond of omens, and it is fair to be cautious about any story polished by decades of devotion. But this episode is unusually well attested in one sense and unavoidably soft in another. Ramakrishna narrated it himself to his disciples, and it appears consistently across the earliest biographical sources. Yet those narrations were the recollections of a man in his 40s, describing his 6th or 7th year, written down by devotees decades later still. The event is secure, The age and the year are traditional reconstructions. It was, by his own account, the first time the door opened, the first of the ecstatic states, later called bhava and samadhi, that would recur throughout his life with such frequency that they eventually became his most famous characteristic. A man who could not hear the name of God sung without losing consciousness. A man photographed only 3 times, once in a state of trance, standing with one hand raised, eyes half closed, supported by a nephew so he would not fall. The story of his visions begins with beauty, not doctrine. It is worth holding on to that. Before Kali, before Vedanta, before the debates about whether he was a saint, a madman, or an avatar, there was a boy in a rice paddy who saw white birds against a black sky and found the sight unbearable. 2. Kamarpukur. To understand what grew from that moment, one has to understand the soil it grew in. Kamarpukur in the 1830s and 1840s was a prosperous but unremarkable village of weavers, farmers, blacksmiths, and confectioners sitting on the old pilgrim road that ran toward the great Jagannath temple at Puri. Sadhus and wandering monks passed through constantly, resting in the village's mango groves and rest houses, and the boy Gadadhar sought them out, listening to their songs and imitating their gestures. Religion in such a village was not a compartment of life. It was the medium in which life took place. The year was structured by festivals, Durga Puja, Shivaratri, Dolyatra, and the imagination of every child was stocked with the stories of the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, and the Bhagavata Purana, performed in night-long musical recitations called yatras and kathakatas. Gadadhar was born on February 18, 1836, into a poor but respected Brahmin family. His father, Gadadhar Chattopadhyay, was a man of almost legendary rectitude. He had once lost his ancestral land rather than give false testimony in court for a landlord. His mother, Chandramani Devi, was guileless, generous, and devout. Both parents reported auspicious dreams and visions surrounding the boy's birth, as the parents of remarkable children in India so often have. The family treated him from the beginning as a gift of their household deity, Raghuvir, a form of Rama. The boy was charming, mischievous, and gifted with an extraordinary memory for songs and sacred stories, but he was a hopeless student in the formal sense. He learned to read and write Bengali, could reproduce entire dramatic performances after a single hearing, and flatly refused to master arithmetic. Later, he dismissed the schooling of his day with a phrase that became famous among his disciples. He wanted nothing to do with a mere bread-winning education, learning whose only purpose was salary. It was an early sign of the temperament that would define him, a total, almost physiological indifference to the ordinary machinery of getting on in the world. The ecstasies continued. At around age 8, again the chronology of these boyhood episodes is approximate. During a festival of the goddess Vishalakshi, he was walking with a party of village women to the neighboring village of Annur when he suddenly stiffened, tears streaming down his face, and passed into trance. The alarmed women chanted the goddess's name over him until he revived. A year or two later, on the night of Shivaratri, he was asked to play the role of Shiva in a village drama when the actor fell ill. Dressed in ash and matted locks, he walked on stage and, by the accounts of those present, became so absorbed in the contemplation of the god he was portraying that he lost outer consciousness entirely. The performance had to be abandoned. The audience, depending on temperament, was either scandalized or awed. His father died in 1843 or 1844, the sources differ, when Gadadhar was about 7, and the boy's inwardness deepened. He began to frequent the cremation ground at night, to spend hours in the mango grove, to serve the sadhus at the rest house. His mother worried. In the vocabulary available to a Bengali village in the 1840s, there were only a few explanations for a boy like this. illness, possession, or sanctity. The question of which it was would follow Ramakrishna for the rest of his life, and he was remarkably capable of asking it about himself. 3. Calcutta. 60 miles away, another world was being born. Calcutta, in the mid-19th century, was the second city of the British Empire, a raw, booming, unequal metropolis of palaces and slums, counting houses and colleges. It was the crucible of what historians call the Bengal Renaissance. English education, introduced decisively in the 1830s, had produced a generation of Bengali intellectuals who read Hume and Mill, debated Christianity with missionaries, and looked with embarrassment on the image worship of their grandfathers. Ramahan Roy had founded the Brahmo Samaj, a reform movement preaching a rational, formless monotheism purged of idols, castes, and priests. By the 1850s and 60s, under Debendranath Tagore and then the charismatic Keshab Chandra Sen, the Brahmos represented the religious future as the educated classes imagined it: modern, ethical, respectable, and deeply uneasy about the goddess Kali with her garland of severed heads. Into this city in 1852 came the 16-year-old Gadadhar, brought by his much older brother Ramkumar, who ran a small Sanskrit school there. And in 1855 came the event that fixed the course of his life. Rani Rashmoni, a formidable and immensely wealthy widow of the fisherman caste, completed a vast temple complex at Dakshineswar on the east bank of the Ganges a few miles north of the city. A temple to Kali as Bhavatarini, she who carries beings across the ocean of the world. Because of the Rani's low caste, Orthodox Brahmins refused to serve there. Ramkumar, poor and pragmatic, accepted the priesthood. When he died in 1856, his strange young brother inherited the shrine. The irony deserves notice. At the precise moment when educated Bengal was trying to modernize its religion out of existence, its most consequential religious figure was taking up residence in a temple that respectable society considered slightly disgraceful, serving a goddess the reformers found barbaric, employed by a woman the pandits deemed untouchable. Everything that followed happened on the margins of the Bengal Renaissance, and eventually bent it toward itself. 4. The Sword and the Ocean of Light. What happened to Ramakrishna at Dakshineswar between 1856 and roughly 1858 is the heart of his story, and he told it himself repeatedly to the disciples who later recorded his conversations. The young priest's ritual duties involved dressing, feeding, and worshipping the black stone image of Kali. But for him the routine curdled into crisis. Was the image stone, or was someone there? The question ceased to be theological and became unbearable, a physical hunger. He began to weep through the services, to rub his face against the ground, crying out to the goddess as a child cries for its mother, asking why she would not show herself. Crowds gathered to watch the mad priest. He stopped sleeping. He later said that the days ended with the anguished thought that another whole day had passed, and still he had not seen her. The climax, in his own telling, came suddenly. One day the agony reached such a pitch that his eyes fell on the ritual sword kept in the Kali shrine, and he resolved to end his life with it then and there. He seized the sword, and the world dissolved. His description of what followed is one of the most famous passages in modern religious literature. The temple, the doors, the vessels of worship, everything vanished, and in their place he perceived what he called a boundless, luminous ocean of consciousness, with shining waves rushing toward him from every direction. They broke over him, he said, and swallowed him, and he fell senseless to the floor of the shrine. Within there remained only a steady flow of undiluted bliss, and the presence of the mother. From that day the visions came unbidden and in torrents. He reported seeing Kali not as stone but as living presence, perceiving her breathing, seeing her form in darkness, shining as if lit from within, watching her, as he put it, in everything, in the image, in the marble floor, in the cat that wandered into the temple, to which he once offered the goddess's own food, to the horror of the temple officials. Ritual propriety collapsed under the weight of the experiences. He would feed himself the offerings meant for the deity, or place flowers on his own head instead of on the image. Reports went to the temple proprietors that the priest had gone insane. Mather Babu, the Rani's son-in-law and the temple's manager, came to observe and made the decision on which everything depended. He concluded that whatever was happening to the young priest, it was not ordinary madness, and took him under lifelong protection. Ramakrishna himself was less certain, and this is one of the most striking features of the record. He consulted his own experience like a skeptical physician. Was he ill? He would later tell his disciples frankly that he had sometimes wondered whether the visions were a disease of the brain, and that he had tested them, asking the mother in effect for verification, demanding that if the visions were true, they should be confirmed. A real physician, the distinguished Dr. Mahendralal Sarkar, would examine him decades later and pronounce the trance's genuine states beyond his voluntary control, while cheerfully telling the saint to his face that he did not accept his divinity. Ramakrishna enjoyed the man immensely. 5. The Divine Madwoman and the Naked Monk. The years from about 1858 to 1865 were, by his own description, a hurricane. He later said of this period that a storm of divine madness swept over him, that he could not tell when the sun rose or set, and that his body was kept alive only because others fed it. His family, alarmed, tried the traditional remedy for a distracted young man. In 1859, they married him to Saradamani Devi, a 5-year-old girl from a neighboring village, in a purely ceremonial child betrothal of the kind then customary. Sarada Devi would join him at Dakshineswar as an adult in 1872. The marriage was never consummated, and she became his foremost disciple. In one of the most extraordinary gestures of his life, he formally worshipped his own wife as the Divine Mother in the Shodashi Puja of 1872, the priest offering the fruits of all his practice at the feet of a living woman. Marriage changed nothing. Back at Dakshineswar, the states intensified, and his body itself became a theater of symptoms that devotees read as yogic phenomena and physicians read with furrowed brows. Burning sensations, sleeplessness, blood rushing to the chest and throat, the inability to close his eyes. What he needed, and what the age improbably supplied, was expert guidance. It arrived in 1861 in the form of a wandering female ascetic in ochre robes, Yogeshwari, called the Bhairavi Brahmani, a woman learned in the Tantras and in Vaishnava devotional disciplines. She listened to the young priest's account of his states and delivered a diagnosis that reversed the frame entirely. He was not sick, she declared. He was undergoing Mahabhava, the supreme ecstasy described in the devotional scriptures, the same that had possessed the medieval saints Radha and Chaitanya. She is reported to have said that the world calls such men mad, and to have convened panels of pandits at Dakshineswar to debate the question, arguing before them, successfully in the event, that Gadadhar's condition matched the scriptural signs of avatara, divine incarnation. Whatever one makes of the verdict, its human effect was immediate. The frightened young man learned that his inner life had a map. Under the Brahmani's direction, from roughly 1861 to 1863, Ramakrishna practiced the disciplines of the 64 principal Tantras, a path that deliberately courts what convention fears, using the energies of the world rather than renouncing them, and one that his Victorian-era biographers handled with visible nervousness. He reported that each discipline bore fruit in vision after vision, and that throughout them all he remained, as he insisted, in the consciousness of the mother, untouched. He practiced the Dasya Bhava, the servant's attitude, worshipping Rama as Hanuman had. living for a period on fruits and roots, spending time in trees until, he said, the vision of Sita entered his body and merged into him. He practiced the Madhura Bhava of the Vaishnavas, the lover's attitude toward Krishna, even dressing in women's clothes for a period to annihilate the male ego, culminating, he reported, in a vision of Krishna that merged into his own person. Then, in 1865, came the counterstroke. A tall, powerfully built, entirely naked monk named Totapuri, Ramakrishna called him simply Nangta, the naked one, arrived at Dakshineswar. Totapuri was an Advaita Vedantin of the most austere type, a man who had spent 40 years in disciplines aimed at the realization that only the impersonal absolute, Brahman, is real, and that all forms, including the forms of gods, are appearances. He regarded Ramakrishna's ecstatic devotion to Kali with the affectionate contempt of a mathematician watching someone weep over an equation. He offered to teach him the path of the formless. Ramakrishna's account of what followed became one of his signature stories. Initiated into sannyasa, instructed to withdraw the mind from every form, he found that he could detach from everything except one thing, the radiant form of the mother herself, which rose before his inner eye every time and dissolved his resolve into bliss. He confessed his failure. Totapuri, in the famous account, looked around, picked up a shard of glass, pressed its point between Ramakrishna's eyebrows, and said sternly, "Concentrate the mind on this point." Ramakrishna sat. When the beloved form of Kali arose again, he later said, he used his discrimination as a sword. The sword again, now turned inward, and severed the form in two. The last barrier fell, and he passed into Nirvikalpa Samadhi, the formless absorption that Vedanta describes as the disappearance of all distinction between knower and known. He remained in that state, the accounts say, for 3 days, his body like a corpse, while Totapuri watched in astonishment. The monk had needed 40 years to reach what this temple priest entered in 3 days. Totapuri stayed at Dakshineswar 11 months, an unheard-of breach of his rule of never remaining anywhere more than 3 days, and in the tradition's telling, left having learned something himself, stricken by illness, prevented, by the goddess the story insists, from drowning himself in the Ganges, he came to accept that the Absolute and its power, Brahman and Shakti, the formless and the mother, were one and the same, like fire and its burning power. That formula, Brahman and Kali as two faces of one reality, became the theological center of everything Ramakrishna taught afterward. 6. As many faiths, so many paths. If the story ended there, Ramakrishna would be a remarkable but recognizably traditional Hindu mystic. What happened next is what made him a world historical figure, and it is important to state it carefully because it is both well documented and easily sentimentalized. In 1866, a Sufi-inclined Muslim guide named Govinda Rai was living near the temple garden. Ramakrishna, whose curiosity about God had the character of an appetite, asked to be initiated into Islamic practice. For a period of days he repeated the name of Allah, dressed in the manner of a Muslim, ate food prepared in Muslim style, and, most scandalously for a Brahmin temple priest, lost all inclination to visit the Kali shrine or think of the Hindu gods at all. The practice culminated, he reported, in the vision of a radiant, grave, white-bearded personage who approached and merged into him, after which his consciousness passed through the personal God into the same formless absolute he had reached through Vedanta. The road was different. The summit, he concluded, was the same. 8 years later, in 1874, the experiment repeated itself with Christianity. At the garden house of his devotee Jadunath Malik, he sat before a painting of the Madonna and Child. As he gazed, he said, the figures became luminous, and rays of light from the picture entered his heart, driving out, again, every Hindu thought. For 3 days he was possessed by the Christian current. Then, walking in the Panchavati grove at Dakshineswar, he saw a serene, fair-skinned foreigner approaching him with steady gaze, and an inner voice announced the figure as the Christ, love incarnate, who embraced him and merged into his body, sending him once more into ecstasy. Skeptical readers will note correctly that Ramakrishna's Islam and Christianity were brief, visionary, and encountered largely through Hindu categories. Days of practice, not years, visions, not communities, no mosque, no church, no law, no creed. Scholars have debated ever since whether what he tested was Islam and Christianity or his own capacious ability to reach ecstasy through any symbol offered to him. But the conclusion he drew was, for 19th century religion anywhere on earth, astonishing. He compressed it into a Bengali phrase his disciples never tired of quoting, Jato mat, tato path, as many faiths, so many paths. He liked to elaborate it in homely images. Water is one, he would say, though Hindus call it jal, Muslims pani, and the English water. A lake has many ghats, and people draw the same water from different steps. He claimed, and no major religious figure had quite said this before as a matter of personal experiment rather than philosophical charity, that he had practiced the disciplines of several religions and found that they converge. He never became a reformer. He never told anyone to leave their religion, including the Brahmos who came to him hoping he would endorse theirs. He remained to the end a priest of Kali who spoke village Bengali, told earthy parables about fishwives and snake charmers, and went into samadhi at the sound of a devotional song. 7. The Room by the Ganges. The last phase began in 1875, when Ramakrishna sought out Keshab Chandra Sen, the most famous religious personality in Bengal, leader of the modernist Brahmo Samaj. The encounter should have been a collision. The polished, English-speaking monotheist reformer and the semi-literate, image-worshipping ecstatic. Instead, Keshab was captivated, wrote and lectured about the Paramahamsa of Dakshineswar, and thereby did something no one could have predicted. He made the educated youth of Calcutta curious about a Kali priest. They came by boat and carriage up the river, students, clerks, professors, skeptics on a lark. Among them, in 1881, came a college student of 18 named Narendranath Datta, a Brahmo sympathizer soaked in Western philosophy, who asked the question he had been putting to every religious teacher in Calcutta. "Sir, have you seen God?" Every previous respondent had equivocated. Ramakrishna's reply, as Narendranath told it ever afterward, was immediate. Yes, he saw God as clearly as he saw the young man before him, only far more intensely, and God could be shown. Narendranath spent years testing, resisting, and finally surrendering to him. The world knows him as Swami Vivekananda, who carried Ramakrishna's many paths to the Parliament of Religions at Chicago in 1893 and set in motion the global career of modern Hinduism. From 1882, another visitor, a reticent schoolmaster named Mahendranath Gupta, began keeping a diary of the master's conversations in the small room at the northwest corner of the temple courtyard. The songs, the parables, the sudden trances, the teacups and pillows, and mundane interruptions. Published over decades under the modest initial M, the Sri Ramakrishna Katamrita, rendered in English as the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, is the reason we possess something almost unique in the history of mysticism, a near stenographic record of a visionary saint's daily speech, set down while he lived. In its pages, the ecstasies are not legends but scenes with dates. Ramakrishna standing transfixed in the middle of a sentence, devotees singing until he loses outer consciousness, his own laughing, disarming commentary afterward on where he had been. In the middle of 1885 came pain in the throat, then bleeding, cancer. His disciples moved him to a garden house at Kosipur, on the northern edge of Calcutta. The visions did not stop. By the testimony of those present, they intensified even as the body failed, and he continued teaching in whispers, distributing in the tradition's language everything he had. To the doubters who asked why the mother did not cure her own child, he gave answers that were by turns playful and unfathomable. In the small hours of August 16th, 1886, he spoke the name of Kali 3 times, entered a final samadhi, and did not return. Sarada Devi, about to remove the bracelets of a widow, reported that he appeared to her and stopped her, the first posthumous vision in a tradition that has never stopped having them. 8. Coda, The Boy and the Birds. What is a modern reader to make of the visions of Ramakrishna? The honest answer is that the facts are unusually secure, and their interpretation is unusually open. That he experienced frequent, involuntary, profoundly transformative states of consciousness is, for his adult years, about as well documented as anything in 19th century religious history. Recorded by eyewitnesses, examined by physicians, and described in his own words in a contemporaneous diary. For the childhood episodes, we depend on his own retrospection, filtered through devoted biographers. Their substance is consistent across tellings, but their dates and ages are approximations. What those states were depends entirely on the frame one brings. Devotees see the self-revelation of God through a supremely transparent human being. Psychologists and neurologists, beginning in Ramakrishna's own lifetime, have proposed epilepsy, cataleptic trance, and other clinical readings, while generally conceding, as Dr. Sarkar did, that the man was lucid, humorous, shrewd about human character, and wholly without the disintegration that mental illness usually brings. Historians of religion tend to bracket the metaphysical question and note the effects. A village priest who never wrote a book, never traveled abroad, and never learned English somehow reversed the direction of the Bengal Renaissance, gave modern Hinduism its most influential single idea, the experiential harmony of religions, and did it all from a single room, mostly by telling stories and occasionally falling into ecstasy in the middle of them. Ramakrishna himself characteristically offered the least defensive account. God, he liked to say, cannot be described, only tasted, and he compared the mystic to a salt doll that went to measure the depth of the ocean. But perhaps the most objective thing that can be said is also the simplest, and it returns us to the paddy field. Whatever the visions were, they began as an experience of beauty so overwhelming that a small boy's ordinary consciousness could not contain it. Everything that followed, the sword in the Kali temple, the ocean of light, the naked monk and the shard of glass, the days as a Muslim and the 3 days with Christ, the room full of college students by the Ganges, can be read as a 60-year attempt to walk back into that moment and stay there. Dark cloud, white cranes. The whole of it was already present in the contrast, the world in its blackness, and across it, unbidden and impossible to look away from, a line of light. He fell down in the mud, and the puffed rice scattered, and the villagers carried him home. He always insisted they had misunderstood what they were carrying. It was not a sick child. It was, he said, joy.